Hello and welcome. Today we're discussing interview skills for pre-professionals. When we're talking about interview preparation, we're thinking mostly of those who are going into medical school, although many of the tips that I'm giving today are going to be applicable to physician assistant schools, the dental programs, things of that nature. We're thinking of professional school interviews. This is going to be a three-part series. The video that you're watching today is going to focus on preparing for the interviews. We'll then have an interview that talks specifically about what to do the day of, and then we will also have a video that talks about both the Casper interviews and the multiple mini interviews. First things first, when we're thinking of an interview, remember that it's a two-way conversation to determine fit. It may feel like you are the only one on display, and of course, this is a competitive process, and that is the case, but they are also on display. You want to make sure that you're at a school that's going to suit your needs. The interview requires practice and preparation. You're going to improve with experience, but remember that it doesn't have to be perfect, and indeed it won't be perfect because we are humans, we're prone to error, and so there's going to be an answer that you don't have an answer to, or a question you don't have an answer to. You might flub when you're giving an answer. That's okay. Ultimately, if you have confidence and enthusiasm, your personality will come through, and that's going to guide you through the interview piece. Okay, thinking before the interview and how we prepare. Before even we apply, I would recommend checking your voicemail, your social media accounts. Oftentimes those, especially the social media accounts, are considered as a part of your application. You may be reviewed probably before the interview. Someone may look you up, so make sure that everything is either private or appropriate. And we're going to talk about these three different components, but before the interview, we're going to research ourselves, we're going to research the profession that we're going into, and we're going to research the schools that we're applying to. In that first piece, researching ourselves, it's important to do some brainstorming about our skills, our personal qualities, our strengths, and our weaknesses, because there are going to be questions that get to these points throughout the interview. And if we're not able to talk about ourselves, then we're not going to be able to get very far in the interview without taking pauses and struggling somewhat. Some suggestions for how you can do some of that research is with a personality or a strengths inventory. All Creighton students at some point have likely taken the Clifton Strengths for Students assessment. It may be that it's been a while since you've taken it. Know that as a Creighton alumni, you're welcome to take that at any time for free. So if you email the Career Center at careercenter@creighton.edu and ask for a strengths code, we can connect you with that. Revisit those results. See what strengths you have, where you use them. Get reminded about how you use your talents in your day-to-day life. There are also different personality inventories. We have some suggested on our website. 16 Personalities is another good one. It's similar to the MBTI, and you could take that and again revisit how you use your different strengths and how they interact with different aspects of your life. I also suggest taking an inventory of your experiences. And now here, this would be thinking about different times that you've encountered both good examples of patient care, times that you faced challenges with patient care. Think of different things you've encountered while you've shadowed, if you've done research, what that has entailed, thinking about part-time jobs or internships, both within healthcare and out of healthcare. What have you learned? What have been your big lessons? What have been things you've been really proud of? What have been some failures that you've faced? Things like that. Also consider activities that you've done, perhaps while you were in school on campus. If you're now an alumni and you're engaged in the community, consider those pieces. Think about your hobbies, whether you traveled abroad or gone on faculty-led programs, ILAC, pieces like that. And then also consider service. Again, thinking about moments that stood out to you for one reason or another. Cataloging these types of experiences in advance of the interview will help give you some ideas of stories you might want to share. And if there's some that you are particularly gravitating towards, practicing discussing the highlights of those experiences will certainly giving you a leg up in preparation for the interview. So then thinking about some of the common questions we can anticipate getting asked in that interview process. The very first one is tell me about yourself, and sometimes this is the most complicated because on the surface it seems vague. What I recommend with this question is thinking about brief, and by brief I mean around 45 seconds to a little less than 2 minutes answer that expresses who you are in relation to what you're applying for. So if you're applying to medical school, give us a little bit of background about your past in relation to medical school and your aspirations, a little bit about what you're doing currently, and then where you would like to go. And that can often guide your answer. And it's fine to also include pieces that are different from medical school, of course. So perhaps things that you're doing, like service that you're really involved in, hobbies that are really unique to you that you're interested in, pieces like that. But the focus, about 75% of your answer, should be focused on healthcare or on your aspirations for that type of program you're applying for. And here we have the where are you from, what are you doing now, where are you going? The next question that we can anticipate being asked is, why do you want to be a doctor or physician's assistant or pharmacist, etc.? And now for this piece, there are some red flags that interviewee could fall into, the biggest being that you don't answer the question, or you answer the question in such a way that it could apply to different professions. So if I ask you why you want to be a doctor, for example, and your answer to me is that you've always been called to help people and that you want to be an advocate for those whose voices aren't heard, of course, that's fantastic. And I'm sure that does play into your answer. So it's okay that that's part of your answer, but if that's the only answer I receive from you, well, then why couldn't you be a nurse, or why couldn't you be a social worker for that matter? Why couldn't you be a physician's assistant? When I hear the answer to why do you want to be a doctor in this instance, I really do want to know or have an understanding that this is the profession that you want to be in. There wouldn't be another one for it. You certainly don't want the interviewer to think that you don't really understand what the profession entails, which could be if your answer is vague. So I would spend some time thinking about this question. It doesn't need to be memorized, but I would want the highlights remembered. Other pieces to consider is your answer easy to follow? So having that practice in advance will ensure that you can get from A to B to C without jumping around. So if you don't practice that, that's another pitfall you could fall into. And then the other very common question is, how will you handle the challenges of professional school? Now, they may not ask you that question so straightforward. They might ask you, what are your strengths and weaknesses? What's a time that you manage stress? Give me an example of a time that you failed in the past. But the reasons they're asking those types of questions is often, can you handle the challenges of professional school? So ask yourself that in advance when you're thinking of things to inventory, is why you'll be successful. Thinking about the strengths you have in that area. Think about the coping skills that you have, times that you've had challenges in the past that you've overcome, and be prepared to give examples of those types of traits in your answers, regardless of how they ask this question. And here, just some other notes. Can you show a track record of success? Do you know what you're getting into? Do you understand what the challenges are of the professional school that you're applying for? And then we have just some additional common questions here. It might be, what makes you unique? Tell me about a time you had a meaningful patient interaction, or perhaps a challenging one. Is your MCAT or similar test score a good indication of your academic ability? What will you do if you don't get into professional school this year? And with that last one, I would just say what they're not looking for, I'll go into a different profession. They're looking for, are you going to contact admissions and ask about what was lacking in your application? Are you going to reapply? Are you going to work towards continual improvement, etc.? Okay, preparing stories. So thinking back to what I was talking about earlier, where you're going to do an inventory of your different experiences. After you've done that, I suggest identifying maybe 5 to 10 of your top stories so that you can get prepared for these next questions. So when we have different interview questions in the one-on-one or the two-on-one interviews, typically we have to get to know you questions. So something like, tell me about yourself. We have behavioral questions, which are the most common and what we're going to be preparing for the most. We have skills-based questions, and those are going to be typically like, are you familiar with this type of medical tool, which you shouldn't anticipate in these types of interviews for the school. This would be something you can anticipate in the future. And then situational, which sometimes we do encounter. If you were in this situation and the patient did this, what would you do next? Okay. When we're thinking about preparing stories, we're thinking about the behavioral questions because that's going to be probably close to 90% of most of our interviews. And when I say behavioral questions, that means they're going to ask a question like, tell me about a time that you had conflict with a colleague. And your answer is going to show your behavior in that type of situation. So I would suggest preparing 5 to 10 stories from that list that you cultivated earlier. that's going to show a different range of your behaviors. And so we have some suggestions here. Maybe it's showing your patient interaction, your ability to problem solve, your ability to work in groups, handle conflict, manage stress, take leadership, etc. Now, when you're preparing those stories, think of the STAR method or have it in the back of your mind, because that is a way to relay your stories in a linear fashion. So you're starting with whatever the situation was for your answer, and then you're going to go to what your task was, what your action was, which is the most important piece where you want to spend the most time, and then what the result was of the story. So thinking about a conflict scenario, if I was asked about conflict and now my answer is first laying out the situation, I was in a group project, okay? And then the task, we were meant to write a paper where we each contributed a paragraph, and one of the people continued to show up late and didn't seem as invested in the project as everyone else. Okay, so that's the task then, is that we have to try to determine whether this person is going to continue in the group or how we can navigate that. So then the action is what you did. And I would focus on your actions versus group action. So you wouldn't want to say we approach the individual. You want to say I talked with that person and I asked if everything was going on, and I learned that there was a lot of really heavy things happening in their background. And so as a group, we realized that if we could meet at a different time, that this person was going to be able to be more invested, and we gave them a topic that was going to be more in line with their interests to make that easier on them. And then the result is that we got along better, right? So that would be an example of using the STAR method. And of course, I would have you practice. The Career Center does mock interviews, and we do that not only for students for free, but we also do that for alumni for free. And we can do this virtually too. It doesn't have to be in person, but of course you could also practice with a friend or with a video recording. But keep in mind, we're not aiming for perfection. We're not aiming for memorization. We just want to practice knowing the highlights of the stories that we're sharing. So, of course, we've researched ourselves, but also now thinking of the profession. And now these questions could apply to many different fields, but thinking about the current trends or new technologies in your field. Know what's going on, know about research that's coming up with new and interesting things. It's uncommon that you'll be asked about a specific technology or trend in the interview, but how wonderful if you would be able to volunteer that you have some information that applies to a particular question. Think about the challenges of being whatever it is that you're applying for. So if you're applying to be a doctor, what are the challenges of being a physician, right? And what are the challenges of being a physician's assistant? Are you able to face those challenges? Why? Why so? Think about what is the outcome for your position, and if the field is growing, or why or why not? Are there pain points in that position? Those pieces can also help you anticipate what some questions might be that you might receive. If there's a particular challenge, they might ask you a question that's going to get to the point of whether you could face that challenge, things like that. And then, of course, we're also going to be researching the schools. Now, many of us might be applying widely because we're going to increase the likelihood of our getting into a school. But if we get all the way into that school, we get into the interview, and we don't have it identified why that school is unique, it's not going to come off very well for us. So think about why you want to attend that school specifically. If they have a mission statement that's really key to you or that calls out what makes that program unique. Is there a particular teaching style that they've developed? Is it that the classrooms are bigger or smaller? Is it the faculty? What are the faculty researching? Is it similar with your own interests, etc., etc.? Also thinking about perhaps facilities or their involvement with the community, hospitals that are in the area that you would have access to, things like that. And if you've done all your research online and you would still like to do more, try to encounter students or alumni that are either attending or have attended that institution and get insight from them. If you don't know how to contact students or alumni from that institution, you're welcome to connect with a career advisor. Oftentimes we can help you with that search. And then lastly, as we're preparing for the interview, develop questions for the interviewer. And this helps if you know who you're interviewing with. So if you have done your research and you know that you're going to be interviewing with a current student of the program, but you're also going to be interviewing with a faculty, you might develop questions for both. Or if you're just going to be interviewing with someone from their admissions team, your questions might change. So know who's interviewing you. And then think about what those questions say about you. So you wouldn't want to ask about, when does winter break start, or are there, particular perks to the school program, because that's looking like you're someone who's just interested in where you get to take a break. Instead, think about opportunities maybe to ask about professional development or research or service, or what the culture is like at that school, how you can get involved, and that's going to show them what kind of person you are. And I would recommend preparing more questions, around 5, than you anticipate asking, between 2 to 3, simply because a question might be answered at a different place in the interview process, and it would be too bad if you prepared a question and it was answered, and so that at the end of the day you maybe only have one question to ask. So that's our recommendation. And this has been our presentation on how to prepare for the interview. Of course, let us know if you have questions. You can visit us in Harvard 2015. You can certainly call us to make an appointment, or you can do that online. And we do have drop-in appointments whenever school's in session, Monday through Friday, 2 to 4:30. And again, we have that email, careercenter@creighton.edu, if you have questions or if you're interested in getting one of those assessment codes. My name is Raven Ordelon. It's been a pleasure presenting to you. If you're interested in seeing more, we have a video both on the actual interview day and then also on MMI and Casper questions.